afternoon, and welcome to the second session of Day 1 of the Belize KULCHA Symposium. We hope you enjoyed our morning session on ancient Maya archaeology and post-contact Belize. Please don't forget to support HENB and the KULCHA Symposium by donating to the cause on our website or via the link shown throughout the sessions. We are kicking off this afternoon with our thematic session on collaborative heritage research. Community engagement and inclusivity in heritage research has become an indispensable part of our discipline. With the engagement of stakeholders, adjacent communities, civil society, and the youth, heritage and culture-related research can be better informed and can enhance the cultural identity of communities and individuals. It can also support socio-economic development. The following presentations will address collaborative heritage research methods and approaches that can help us gain a better understanding of our past and present. We will start off this afternoon session with our first presentation by Zachary Nissen, a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at Northwestern University. He has conducted archaeological research at the ancient Maya city of Aventura, Belize, since 2015. His research examines ordinary people's households during a period of stress from 750 to 1100 CE to show how strategies of inclusion can prevent exaggerated inequalities during periods of crisis and can enable cities to maintain robust and diverse populations over the long term. In addition to his research, he has co-organized annual community engagement events with Dr. Cynthia Robin, Aventura Archaeology project staff, and members of the Belize National Institute of Culture and History. We will now hear from Zachary Nissen about ordinary histories of people and place, reconsidering heritage at Aventura, Belize. Go ahead, Mr. Nissen.
I want to begin by acknowledging and honoring the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe tribes, the original people of the land upon which my home institution, Northwestern University, stands in the location where I'm recording right now, as well as the native people who remain on this land today. I also want to thank the organizers of this symposium, particularly Sylvia, for inviting me to contribute this paper, as well as the community members who work with me as part of the Aventura Archaeology project. The title of my talk today is Ordinary Histories of People and Place, Reconsidering Heritage at Aventura, Belize. The archaeological site of Aventura emerges from the countryside as a series of large green hills, seen here on the slide, to the west of the Northern Highway, just to the south of the contemporary village of San Joaquin in the Corozal district of Belize. In this paper, I present insights shared with me while touring and working at the archaeological site of Aventura by community members who live and work the sugarcane fields and forests that now cover the majority of archaeological features. While working at the site to explore its ancient Maya history, locals have shared with me the more recent history of their coming to occupy northern Belize in the mid-19th century, and the ways physical places on the landscape have been charged by supernatural encounters and specific moments of specific family significance. By centering local meaning-making practices, this paper aims to turn attention away from a model that positions foreign archaeologists as heritage educators and turns to a multi-directional model of community collaboration where the expertise of all participants is valued and centered in discussions of heritage education and outreach. I aim to show how community collaboration requires effort on the part of archaeologists to learn and value local histories and practices of meaning-making, while providing resources for locals to reinterpret the ancient past that European colonizers actively erased. Over the past 30 to 50 years, a central question of archaeological practice and research has centered on the ethics of collaborating with descended communities. Recent scholarship on this topic has emphasized the importance of acknowledging the rights and knowledge of Indigenous groups. While heritage is a theoretical tool that documents the social value of places, things, and environments, scholars have critiqued the ways heritage is essentialized, abstracted, and mobilized around issues of tourism and nationalism that result in the marginalization of local communities. This paper considers what it means to engage with a community in which colonial histories have actively erased locals' connections to their ancient Maya ancestors. To do so, it examines the relationship between ordinary people and archaeological spaces and discusses how a better understanding of this relationship can shape engagement efforts by foreign archaeologists. Turning specifically to the everyday encounters that shape my interlocutors' relationships to archaeological remains, I argue that community engagement can better attune to the needs and desires of local stakeholders. The Corozal district is located along Belize's northernmost border with Mexico. The district capital, Corozal Town, was officially founded in 1849 by residents who fled Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, seeking refuge from the caste war, which ranged from 1847 to 1855. The community's origin story is commemorated by a mural painted by the late Manuel Villamor, a Corozal native, which is located in the town hall of the district capital of Corozal Town. In its original form, which was painted or drawn in 1953, Villamor's black and white mural depicts the violence endured by refugees of the caste war. While its later formulations, which was most recently updated in 2014, the mural focuses on the birth and history of Corozal in the aftermath of the caste war. Important to our discussion today is how this mural conveys and illustrates the violent history of the contemporary community's ancestry and their complicated relationships to the Maya who occupied the ancient landscape. I aim to show that these connections, while tenuous and not always up for foreign archaeologists to debate, are still important factors which shape how archaeological spaces can become meaningful and significant in the day-to-day lives of contemporary community members. San Joaquin Village, located approximately 10 kilometers south of Corozal Town, is a smaller village which lies just outside the remains of the ancient Maya city known as Aventura. I have worked at the site as a member of the Aventura Archaeology project, directed by Dr. Cynthia Robin, since its inception in the summer of 2015. Through the course of conducting survey and excavation at the site as part of my dissertation research, I've worked closely with over 30 members of the local community and gotten to know their families and an even larger portion of the community through engagement events, such as tours of the archaeological site and heritage events such as Aventura Archaeology Day, which have been co-sponsored with the National Institute of Culture and History. While conducting this work, I became interested in the stories my colleagues would share about their engagement with archaeological spaces. Unlike sites conserved for tourism, like the nearby site of Santa Rita, also known as Chactemal, which are the common subject of heritage discourse, Aventura is an unconserved site that is frequently engaged with by residents who manage the sugarcane fields or hunt in the bush that now covers the mounded remains of the ancient city. What is important to this discussion is that since it is not designated as a formal archaeological reserve or tourist destination, Aventura's boundaries are not policed by armed guards or fences. Residents of the local community have regular access to the archaeological features and have integrated these spaces into their own sense of belonging to the local landscape. In taking up the idea of local heritage and ancestry, I consider the ways this sense of belonging to a landscape with deep archaeological history enables locals to navigate tensions in their own understandings of what it means to have Maya ancestry in the present. In working at and touring the site with my colleagues, I've become interested in the ways locals narrate moving through archaeological spaces and the various stories that emerge depending on locals' level of engagement with the space, as well as broader geopolitical landscape issues. Often when passing a particular archaeological feature, my colleagues will pause to tell me a story they have heard about the particular location or about their own engagement with the space. For example, in an area to the west of the site, my colleagues have shown me features from a no longer occupied historic settlement where one of my colleagues' grandfather was raised and even born. These stories can range from the mundane to the spectacular. For example, a mundane account includes how particular sets of stones are stacked on mounded features. While surveying archaeological features, I asked my colleagues why some of the mounds we encountered had stacks of stones on top, and it was shared with me that agricultural workers often stack limestone rubble that has collapsed from ancient Maya architecture on the raised mounds as places to rest while cutting sugarcane. The elevated seating prevents ants and other bugs from crawling on the workers while they pause to eat food, and the raised mounds offer the best location to catch the breeze and feel some relief from the hot sun which bakes the burnt ash of sugarcane. Other stories include more spectacular encounters and feature supernatural entities such as duendes or lloronas. For example, when surveying or touring the largest mounds that would have comprised the monumental core of the ancient city seen here on the slide, I'm often told stories of looters attempting to remove elaborate jade or gold artifacts, but who were stopped by supernatural forces such as a large serpent, ancient bees, or duendes, the protectors of the forest. Interestingly, the perpetrators of this looting frequently mirror political discussions about who poses the biggest threat to the community. In 2015, when we were first touring the site, the looters were British quote-unquote researchers who brought in helicopters to remove large carved stones, but were eventually scared away by duendes. I suggest that in our initial season at Aventura, these stories about British looters expressed local anxieties about our work at the site and were meant to be a warning that to what happens if we were to remove valuable objects from the community. However, in following years as we returned, the looters in these stories were Guatemalans who swindled locals out of precious jade objects or who hid in sugarcane fields and looted large mounds at night. At the time, Guatemala was having the presidential elections, and much of the political discourse surrounded geopolitical tensions between Belize and Guatemala, which is understandable given the time. And most recently, the last time I was there in 2019, most the stories included looters that were corrupt officials who brought bulldozers and plowed right through large mounds to take valuables and building materials for themselves. In all of these variations, supernatural entities such as duendes and lloronas scare looters away, or ancient animals such as bees warn locals of the acts so that they can stop looters. In these stories, locals take pride in knowing their cultural resources, and they are charged with protecting their staying in the community. Here, locals' identification of objects deemed valuable by international audiences creates a sense of pride and responsibility related to belonging to the specific landscape. Through listening to these stories, I've learned that while these mounds are not prominently featured as heritage, quote unquote, upon which locals project connections to the Maya past, it is through the process of living in this space and encountering interesting objects, these hills become an anchor in which individual families physically root their coming to exist in this place. These roots serve to connect locals to the landscape vertically beneath them. Thus, while the community's ancestors fled to Corozal from Mexico, they generate a notion of belonging to this specific landscape in ways that doesn't hinge on long-term, uninterrupted ideas of belonging to some abstracted idea of the ancient Maya. Here, historic and Maya mounds are physical reminders of family histories, or similarly, valuable objects that become a source of local pride and protection. Bringing all this together highlights how the importance of archaeological features lies not in abstract identifications of them as heritage or important to history, but in that they are intimately and effectively tied to locals' own personal or family histories. As an archaeologist, I've been trained to approach archaeological sites as places with inherent value around issues of heritage. Viewing sites in this way creates an abstracted view of heritage, though, one that associates a site's value with its past significance. Yet, in this paper, I've attempted to highlight the ways that archaeological sites become meaningful in ordinary contexts. Together, the stories shared with me highlight that while the ancient city is not being used or interacted with in the same ways the ancient Maya would have, these ruins are not frozen in time. However, neither should these stories be romanticized as evidence of an uninterrupted local history. What this paper aims to show are the ways in which heritage and history are lived and the material consequences an approach that centers ruins as global or national heritage can have in the context of people's daily lives. This approach aims to show that while the region has seen the dramatic rise and fall of a series of imperial, state, and colonial polities, which have resulted in the significant population decline and movements, the perspective of ordinary people at Aventura, Belize, and across the Maya region is a story of reinvention and resilience. And as archaeologists, our efforts to engage local communities should center a collaboration with and acknowledgement of ordinary people's local history and expertise. Thank you for attending and listening to the talk today. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat or let Heritage Education Network Belize know. Or if for some reason you can't get a hold of me through them, my email is up on the slide. It's zacharynissen2015@u.northwestern.edu. Thank you again for listening, and I hope you all have a great rest of the day and enjoy the rest of the symposium.
Thank you for that insightful presentation, Mr. Nissen. I now present our second speaker for this segment, Miss Alessandra Villarreal. Alessandra Villarreal is a current PhD candidate at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Her dissertation work is focused on ceramic production and distribution in the Middle Pre-Classic Mopan River Valley. Ms. Villarreal's interest in this topic has led her to work with modern craftspeople and potters in Belize. After she earns her doctorate, she hopes to work in the museum sector, promoting cultural heritage programs and repatriation efforts. We will now hear from Alessandra Villarreal about community archaeology and ancient ceramics, developing an inclusive research design in San Jose Succotz, Belize.
Hi, everyone. Before I begin, I would like to thank all the people who worked countless hours to bring together the first annual KULCHA Symposium. Bringing together multiple voices and perspectives only deepens our understanding of culture, past, present, and future. I would also like to thank my collaborators, Estrella Magana and the late David Magana. Over the past 2 decades, collaborative archaeological projects have really taken on a range of strategies that promote the involvement of different publics, including local and descendant communities in practice and knowledge production. In Belize, local communities are being recognized for their contributions to archaeological research of cultural heritage at multiple stages, including research design, data collection, and community outreach. These projects focus on creating a dialogue between local and descendant communities about the deep past and the convergence of living heritage with material remains. My fellow presenters here today also recognize the importance of that convergence for the sustainability and safeguarding of living culture in all its forms. In these same decades, advances in qualitative and quantitative studies of ancient ceramics have allowed us to further understand ancient Maya economy, socio-political structure, artistic traditions, and cultural change over time. For example, my current dissertation project takes a microscopic look at the composition of Middle Preclassic ceramics dating to around 600 BC to understand how potters created their wares and traveled across the landscape so many years ago. Compositional studies not only tell us about the formation of the ceramic vessels, but also can help pinpoint the locations on the landscape that ancient potters may have accessed for their materials, the materials of their trade. So these methods not only illuminate the distances that ancient potters would travel to collect raw material or the skill required to create great works of art, they also stand to benefit greatly from collaborative research design that incorporates the knowledge and guidance from living traditional potters. In my experience, which I will highlight today, Collaboration makes clear the very real factors that influence potter's choice in raw material. These factors include a deep understanding of the materials themselves, a deep understanding of the behavior of the firing environments that they're using, and the formation techniques that allow ceramic vessels to last upwards of 3,000 years. A project design that seeks to integrate archaeological methods and community collaboration must emphasize the importance of local knowledge in the study of ancient Maya ceramics. This paper serves as a discussion of the collaborative project established with a local traditional potter named David in the village of San Jose Succotz, Belize in 2016 and 2017. The project outlined here will advance archaeological understandings of ancient ceramics, develop a means by which local potters can share their knowledge, and involve the local community in knowledge production regarding their own local history. Oh, excuse me, sorry about that. Further, this introduction of inclusivity into the design and execution of research will help ensure that the knowledge produced by the project is accessible to actors who have traditionally been excluded from academic discourse. Archaeological research has seen a general rise in collaborative project design, methodology, and knowledge production alongside local communities. This trend is a result of our reflection, our self-reflection regarding the role of the discipline in past colonialism, as well as the modern socio-political context of the places in which we work. The call for collaboration is an effort to acknowledge descendant and local communities as major stakeholders in the investigation of the past and maintenance of the present and future. A long-standing example of collaborative ceramic studies comes from Mexico. Dean Arnold, an ethnoarchaeologist who has worked with the same group of traditional Maya potters in Tikul, Yucatan, for more than 40 years, has been at the forefront of integrating living heritage with archaeological evidence of ceramic production. In a recent publication, Arnold stresses the insights gained from close and long-term collaboration with Tikul potters, including the importance of landscape meaning and socio-cultural context in potters' choice of production material. Traditionally, archaeological interpretations of ancient ceramic productions and even wider economic systems, they really center on models of efficiency. However, collaboration with living traditional potters makes it clear that material choice is not based solely on ease of access or even resource proximity, but on a deep understanding of the material, the location of the resource on the landscape, and the intended function of the vessel. Consideration of material choice is important for the archaeological study of ceramics as it speaks against models of absolute efficiency and highlights the essential nature of choice, agency, and expertise of the potter. However, insights such as Arnold's are gained through multiple decades of community collaboration and engagement. These are, really engaged with local communities of potters that maintain this traditional method of production. So the convergence of traditional knowledge, living heritage, archaeological data, and scientific methodology is the framework upon which I have designed my collaborative project in the village of San Jose Succotz. The potters with whom I collaborated most closely for this project are David and Estrella Magana. Some of my fellow presenters and audience members may be familiar with the crafting legacy of the Magana family, both in Succotz and in the broader Lucero district. David and his wife Estrella are master potters who often utilize traditional techniques like hand formation and open pit firing, in addition to more modern wheel and kiln production methods. I first contacted David and Estrella in 2016 because of their interest in the archaeological past of their village, safeguarding artistic traditions, and their deep knowledge of local clay and timber resources that may even have been accessed prehistorically. In 2016, David and I discussed potential sources of clay to test. While brainstorming the kinds of clay sources we wanted to incorporate in the study, David also shared his family's long tradition of pottery, the long distances his grandmother would travel for very specific materials, including clays and sands all the way from Flores, Guatemala, and even his and Estrella's efforts to revitalize traditional pottery making in Succotz. During the 2017 field season, I worked closely with David to access and work with local clays surrounding Shinantanich in the village. Our goal was to collect and process the clay, create tiles, and fire them under different atmospheric conditions. We decided to process the tiles in different ways so that we could compare them to the ancient ceramics I had already excavated from the nearby sites of early Shenandoah and San Lorenzo. We collected from a total of 5 clay sources, 3 of which David accessed regularly for his own work, and 2 that were discovered through archaeological excavation. The first source, called San Lorenzo in this project, was discovered during a geological survey conducted by UT Austin graduate Layla Don. The clay deposit found at the site of San Lorenzo was found with a backhoe trench in context with pre-classic scherts. So it may be that this clay deposit was accessible in the pre-classic period. The second source was located on a bank near the river. It was actually close to the Succotz basketball court, if you all are familiar with that. This clay was yellow in its raw state and had a looser texture than any of the clays tested so far. That's why we collected it, just because it was a really unique deposit. Our third source was accessible from a bank as well, and it was located on a property belonging to the Sosa family of Succotz. With their permission, of course, we collected the clay, which was yellow like the basketball court clay, but had a much firmer texture. So we wanted to kind of compare these two to see how they would behave differently. Because the clay was accessible by a cut in the road, David actually dug a bit deeper into the deposit to access clay that wouldn't have been altered by any environmental factors like exhaust from the road or washout from further up the hill. The fourth source was also buried archaeologically. This was a source from a clay layer just above bedrock at early Shenandoah. We collected a sample of the thick, dark material from below structure E2 at the site because it was accessible in excavations that were open at the time. I targeted this sample because evidence of a burning event that we also saw there seems to have fired the clay to nearly the exact color and texture of the Savannah orange type, which is a type of ceramic that's widely found in the region during the Middle Preclassic period. So this bright orange chunk, essentially, of fired clay really stood out against the black clay that was already there. And it led David and I to have a really deep curiosity about how this clay would react to the firing process. Finally, the last source is the one that was most often utilized by David. It's located at Clarissa Falls, a lodge near Aktun Khan. And it's the furthest from Shenandoah in this study. This deposit is quite large and is visible from the satellite imagery. So you can see it here. This is actually the clay deposit. But whether it was available to pre-classic potters is, as of now, unknown. So once we collected the clays, David and Estrella walked me through the process of how they would prepare it for forming and firing. First, the clay was soaked in large vessels that allowed it to settle to the bottom and the water to be sponged off the top. At this stage, large inclusions like rocks and twigs were sifted out. Though the clay obviously wasn't then in its natural state, 100% natural state, minimal leviation is necessary to ensure correct firing. And this kind of processing would have been necessary to ancient fires as well. After being levigated, David created small tiles from processed clay and we marked each tile with its source. We then fired the tiles in a fogon or hearth that David had in his workshop. The tiles were heated on a plate above the fire first to ensure they didn't crack with the temperature shock. David taught me that this helped prevent wasters, but that explosions in the firing process were still bound to happen, and likely did in the past as well. Once the tiles started to turn red, which was the prime indicator of readiness according to Estrella, they were put directly into the flame. A few of the tiles did break in the process, though the extent of damage really only included cracking and there wasn't any full internal bursting. Overall, the tiles behaved predictably and fired to a varying range of oranges and light brown, which is kind of a common range of ceramics in the region, especially during the Middle Preclassic period. Some tiles were removed and placed into a pile of sawdust to create a reduced atmosphere. This did turn them very black, which likely points to a method used by ancient potters to create some of the black wares that we do find. But since that's not really the focus of my dissertation project, those are going to be put to the side for later analysis. So for a pilot study, I actually sent in a couple of the tiles along with a few archaeological sherds to Wagner Petrographic to create ceramic thin sections. Using a petrographic microscope, I assessed the mineralogical characteristics of the ceramic materials. I sent the tiles to be thin sectioned because I wanted to get kind of a comparison between the clay sources that are there and the archaeological ceramics that we have excavated. And so looking at the slides from the 5 modern tiles, we're able to see what natural inclusions are present in the local clays surrounding Shenandoah. There's still a lot to be done in this investigation. The most crucial next step will be to perform point count analysis on this sample of slides because it allows us to see the mathematical proportions of the minerals and the mineral composition, which will help better define kind of the categories of fabrics that we're seeing and add a statistical significance to any results that we find. Unfortunately, David Magana is no longer with us. His death is really a great loss for the community of Succotz and our project. It's my hope that David's love of his craft and interest in archaeological history of the village will encourage future collaboration between heritage communities and archaeologists there. This collaboration will only increase our understanding of the past and the sustainability of future projects. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Villarreal, for that presentation. We will now follow with a presentation by Frank Tzib and Dr. Jillian Jordan. Unfortunately, Dr. Jordan is not able to be with us today, but we are fortunate to have Mr. Frank Tzib with us. Frank Tzib is Yucatec Maya and lives in San Antonio Village in the Cayo district of Belize. Mr. Tzib graduated from Eden SDA High School and is a member of the Cayo Cave Guide Association. His research interests include pottery, epigraphy, osteology, ethnobotany, and linguistics. We will now hear from Mr. Frank Tzib about pottery production in Belize, how a potter and an archaeologist work together to understand ancient Maya craft production. We have now Mr. Frank Tzib.
Thank you for coming to our presentation today, and thank you to the impressive group of women at the Heritage Education Network for putting this conference together. I will briefly introduce myself and give some background on pottery production in Belize. Then Mr. Frank Tzib will present most of our talk today. My name is Dr. Jill Jordan, and I've been working as an archaeologist in Belize since 2005 when I was a field school student. I'm an archaeologist interested in pottery production to understand how the ancient Maya interacted with one another and with their landscape. I have worked in the Cayo, Stan Creek, and Toledo districts of Belize, so I've studied how pottery was produced across much of the country. Our presentation today focuses on how our research on the ancient Maya, and particularly the Maya living in Stan Creek, is informed by both archaeology and modern production practice. Pottery was produced as early as 1200 BC in Belize and is associated with the earliest permanent settled communities. Ceramic vessels were used to store, cook, and prepare food and drink until around the 1900s when these tools were replaced with metal and plastic containers. We have some information on historic pottery production based on written reports, but for the majority of the Maya occupation in Belize, we must study the pottery itself to understand how it was made. Pottery is the most common artifact found on archaeological sites in Belize. At its most basic, pottery is composed of clay and water that is fired to create a durable container. It is most often encountered as sherds, which are broken pieces of whole ceramic vessels. Ancient Maya pottery comes in a variety of shapes, colors, and sizes. There are two primary ways that archaeologists study pottery. We study how the pottery looks, called stylistic analysis, and we study how the pottery was made, called technological analysis. Both types of analysis provide important information about the ancient Maya. Stylistic analysis focuses on how a vessel looks and examines features like color, the painted decoration, and the overall form of the vessel. So, for example, is the vessel used as a plate for serving food or a jar for serving water? This slide shows a plain jar on the left and the elaborately painted com vessel from Baking Pot on the right. Studies focused on technology examine the clay portion of the vessel and is often used to determine where and how a pot was made. For example, Belize can be divided into broad geologic zones: limestone to the north, granite in the Maya Mountains, and sandstone in the Toledo district. Pottery made out of these different raw materials looks different and can be used to determine where a pot was produced and can provide information on long-distance trade. Now I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Frank Tzib to introduce himself and complete our presentation.
My name is Frank Tzib. I am from the beautiful village of Oshimulka, place of the Three Hills, now known as San Antonio in the Cayo district. So I was always interested about how those beautiful pottery vessels found on Maya sites and even on my own backyard were made, and the process required to create such a masterpiece out of raw earth or clay. I would look in awe at the pieces found in ancient Maya sites. As a Yucatec Maya, I believe that pottery plays a big role in the identity of our culture as a whole. Pottery production has been practiced for thousands of years by our people, from commoners to royal people. Therefore, knowing the history of tradition in our culture and seeing how it is slowly dying with time is what drives me to learn, practice, and share this beautiful tradition to others. I love studying pottery because in this way, I can help to continue this tradition for future generations. Not to mention how much fun it is to work and develop your artistic skills while you do it. So it all started when my grandfather mentioned to me that he knew a bit of the process because he saw his mom working with it when he was small. The name of the clay type used for making pottery is he, according to my grandfather. My great-grandmother had to walk 8 miles in order to find the good clay, which is the he, and bring it back home. With a smile on his face, grandfather mentioned that it was always fun for him to work with clay because he was the one who got to knead the clay by jumping on it for hours until the clay is well kneaded and mixed with sand and water. My great-grandmother would store her kneaded clay on a rubber and further use it afterwards. When she's ready, she would take a portion of the clay enough to make a pot and knead it again. To take all the air out of the clay, she would roll out these long worms of clay and start to coil them as if it was Ferdinand snake resting under the trees, grandfather said, trying to be funny. The other method great-grandmother practiced was by using a mold made out of wood in the shape of the pot she desired to make, and would wrap it with clay and play with it, grandfather said. When the clay pot is ready, she would let it dry for some time, which my grandmother is not sure how much time. Right after the pot is dry enough, she would fire it on her fire hearth. You would know when it is ready, because it will turn in a red color, like the coals around it, grandfather added. I would sit and eagerly hear these stories from my grandfather the whole day and just wish I could learn more and start to put it into practice. It was until one day I received a call from Miss Timotea Mesh, the president of the San Antonio Women's Cooperative. She asked me if I am willing to help out with the painting of their pottery vessels and that they would teach me. My first day I was given an introduction to pottery and I got to feel what that clay grandfather always mentioned felt like. Rafael Canto patiently taught me all he knew and would always be a motivation for me because he always believed in my potential to learn. I met Dr. Jill in 2018 when we both worked with the SCRAP, the Stand Creek Regional Archaeology Project, directed by Dr. Megan Paramaki Brown and Dr. Sean Morton. We work at the site of Alabama, located near the modern-day village of Mayamopan in the Stand Creek District. Since 2008, we have been working to understand pottery production at late to terminal classic Alabama. We're interested in two primary questions. How was the pottery made, and where did potters get the raw material to make their pottery? These questions will allow us to understand local pottery production at the site of Alabama, as well as interactions between Alabama and other parts of the ancient world. The basis pottery production process is similar in many parts of the world. Potters first need to collect their raw materials. These raw materials are often processed. The vessel is formed into the desired shape, then decorated and fired. Not all these steps are required for every ceramic vessel, and the raw material used in pottery production and the way that potters process, form, decorate, and fire pottery differs even within the Maya region. Clay is abundant on the landscape. Anyone who walks around in Belize after a rain and has to remove sticky dirt from their shoes know this very well. But what is it? Clay are sediments that formed by the weathering of rocks. Dry clay looks like a powder, seen in the lower right image. But when water is added to the clay, the particles stick to one another and can also slide by one another, providing a material that can be shaped into different forms when wet. The best clay for making pottery are found on riverbanks or by streams. This is because clay is impermeable, and when water is running, it will wash sediments of soil and rocks, leaving pure clay on site. To collect clay, it is good to dig roughly 3 to 4 feet underground to obtain the best clay. To know which clay to use, you have to wet the clay first and knead it and roll them out like little worms and bend them. The more you can bend them, the clay would be better. Archaeologists think of raw material in terms of their technical properties, composition, and location on the landscape. Worldwide, most potters collect their raw materials from near their homes. When archaeologists sample clay, we most often sample a variety of different places across the landscape near to the site where we are working. We will then analyze attributes like colors, textures, and type of rocks and mineral inclusions. Although archaeologists know how to identify clay by making a little worm, most of us are not knowledgeable enough to know if a clay we sample is good or bad for making pottery. Not all clays are ideal for making pots, and their natural state, so potters will add materials, what archaeologists call temper, to the clay to improve its quality. The added materials serve as a variety of purpose to make the clay more workable and suitable for pottery production. The most common tempers used in Belize are crushed rocks and sand, but potters also use grog and jute shells. Potters may have added temper to increase the strength of the clay, to decrease the stickiness, and to reduce the shrinkage in the drying process. Clay itself is strong when fired, but to make it more consistent, we need to add sand. Depending on the method one is using to create pieces, and the type of usage of the pot will determine the kind of sand to mix clay with. Coarse sand will be used for bigger pots to make it stronger for it to hold more weight. Fine sand is used for smaller pots or drinking vessels because it is easier to close the pores of the clay and hold water. While doing the research with Dr. Jill Jordan, I learned that in ancient times, or even in other Maya communities, Mayas would use burnt jute to mix with their clay or even ashes of pumice rocks. Archaeologists think about temper in much the same way we think about clays. We sample a variety of different rocks and sand from near an archaeological site to compare to the pottery. The type of temper can also provide important information on where a ceramic vessel was produced. For example, Alabama is surrounded by granite, and there is no limestone near the site. So, if we notice that a ceramic vessel is tempered with limestone at Alabama, we know that the pottery was produced somewhere far away from the site. The Stand Creek Regional Archaeology Project brings together people with different specialties. Ms. Aurora Saki also helped us understand how the ancient Maya pottery was made. Here you see me and Ms. Aurora making pottery using clay and sand from the Stand Creek district. The archaeologists have taught me a lot. At first, I thought that potters only added sand to clay to make it more consistent and better for making pottery. Working with archaeologists, I learned that other Maya communities in Belize would add crushed jute, and that the ancient Maya would also use a variety of different kinds of temper, including sand, limestone, shell, crushed rock, and volcanic ash. Working with archaeologists have helped me broaden my view on pottery, as in the different types of variety that archaeologists use to date on archaeological sites. I also learned that provenience, or where a pot was made, can be determined based on the type of clay present in pottery shard. It also helped me to have an idea of how archaeologists gather data to understand provenience. Miss Aurora and I have also taught the archaeologists a lot about how to make pottery. One afternoon, we fired a bunch of pottery that Miss Aurora made in her kitchen hearth in Maya Center. We collected different kinds of fuel, including corn cobs, and fired the vessel until they were red. We then took them out of the fire to see how they looked. Archaeologists rarely participate in the entire production process, and this helped them to think different about ancient Maya activities. Most ceramic analysis in the Maya region depends almost entirely on describing what a vessel looks like. The pottery pieces we find at Alabama are primarily body shards without any feature that tell us the form of the vessel, example if it is a jar or a bowl, or decoration to provide clues about where it was produced. We decided to analyze paste characteristics, so the clay and temper component, because these attributes can be analyzed on poorly preserved shards. Our focus on paste characteristics and how the pottery was produced require knowledge not only about archaeology but how to make pottery and where to find the resources on the landscape. A group of archaeologists, traditional knowledge specialists, and potters work together to understand pottery production at Alabama. We determined that two groups of potters likely lived at late classic Alabama. We used different raw materials and produced different vessels formed. Our approach with Megan and Jill contributing our archaeology and material science, knowledge of Miss Aurora, and Silvestro approaching the research from the standpoint of contemporary practice, we have a much better understanding of the Alabama pottery than any of us could achieve on our own. Thank you for listening to our presentation, and we look forward to your questions after the session. A special thank you for Rebecca Friedel for recording this lecture so that we would prepare this presentation from both Belize and the United States.
Thank you for that informative presentation. We will now move on to our question and answer segment. We have Mr. Nissen, Ms. Villarreal, and Mr. Tzib on the panel to answer your questions. Remember that you can drop your questions into the comment section so that we may ask our panelists. Do we have any questions, audience? All right. All right, while we wait for questions to come in, Mr. Nissen, Ms. Villarreal, Mr. Tzib, how are you?
Doing well, thank you.
Same here, good.
It's excellent. I'm happy to hear. All right. We have a question from James Chaneb. Are there any other ways, like the use of technology, to know whether or not the clay is a usable clay, or is it just a method of wrapping it around your finger? I believe that question is for you, Mr. Sir. Mr. Tzib, we can't seem to hear you. Can you double check that your mic is on? We seem to be having some technical difficulties. While we get that sorted out, let's attempt. Right. We have another question here coming in. What do you suggest we do to create more exposure to clay pots?
I think this one came in maybe during my presentation, in which case maybe Sadie meant the exposure to like the work being done. And I think it also relates to Frank and Dr. Jordan's paper as well. But there are a number of obviously living community members who do practice traditional pottery making, and it's really a sense of kind of getting to know those practitioners, obviously, in your village, especially in Succotz or San Antonio. I know there's a pretty strong tradition in San Antonio, but I think that it really is about making that contact first, and then I think one of the advantages we have right now obviously is like social media. Like, this is happening because of social media platforms, and so I think getting that exposure, obviously with the permission of the practitioners, but getting that exposure out there is how you can help kind of safeguard that heritage, because there might be someone, you know, on your TikTok or your Snapchat that like has a deep interest in this, but just doesn't know where to go. And I think that kind of, if that's the kind of exposure you mean, I think that's kind of one of the tools that's to the advantage of our generation, is getting that information out there.
That's very true, Miss Villarreal. Social media makes a lot possible now. We have another question coming in here from Lisa Lucero. What do you think the chances are finding ancient Maya pottery production sites? I ask because I conducted a ceramic refiring experiment at the UCLA kiln room and found that between the clays and tempers used, plus the range of temperatures achieved by open air fires, that it would be very difficult to find any evidence in the archaeological record. Do we have any of you would like to take that question?
I could speak to that unless one of the other two presenters would like to jump in as well. I don't know if Frank, you have specific intel or insight on this as well, but for what I've been studying, I do think that it is likely that you wouldn't find open pit firing, just because just, you know, the density of archaeological data in Belize especially is just finding something like an open pit would be really difficult unless it's kind of constructed into maybe like a hillside or something like that. You might be able to find it. I would really expect that, because a lot of the soils in Belize are kind of clay rich, at least where I am, but we're in a river valley, so that's probably why. But you would think that it would fire some of that clay, but as far as, you know, where I am, we don't find too much data on that. It's also possible with my work with David, and probably Frank and his family members can attest, a lot of times wasters, which are a lot of the kind of evidence of, you know, like firsthand firing, a lot of the firsthand evidence of that, a lot of wasters are ground up and used again as grog. So, you know, you're not going to be finding as much hard data.
Right. Thank you for your response, Ms. Villarreal. We have a question coming in here from Ingwer Seeloff. What are, for you, the 3 most important points to get community people involved and motivated in living archaeology? And what is the benefit for them? I think this question is directed more towards Mr. Nissen.
Sure. I don't know if I have 3 specific points that are important here, because I think it's sort of up to the community. I think it is really important for archaeologists to sort of go out and ask and see what communities are interested in. I think often archaeologists sort of will colloquially talk about how community engagement is really difficult because communities aren't interested in the things that they're sharing. And I think that becomes a problem of archaeologists to sort of figure out, is exactly sort of what this question is about. I think in my own context, just like talking to people and hanging out with them for a period of multiple years of doing research at the site has really shown that just everyday conversations about like ancient life and everyday life are things that people are really interested in talking about. So I think that's just something that has come up over the period of a few years. And I think events like this are really important for getting out there and just sort of sharing information and interacting with people. So that's not like a concrete way to do it, but just really starting those conversations early on and reaching out and just being open to dialogue and seeing the directions that conversations go is really important. And just being open to sort of rethinking how information is disseminated, right? We do a lot of events in the area that I work in, and I think a lot of our events have really been influenced by local NGOs. So I think Miss Adela is giving a talk tomorrow, I think, with the NGO Te One Mase Hualun. We've had many conversations with them in northern Belize about how do we get people to engage? How can we present things in ways that the community are interested in? We do lots of tours of the site, and I think it's really just like being self-reflexive and seeing like what are things that people are responding to, and how can we sort of make a bigger impact or just cater an event to exactly what people are looking for. I think that's the way forward. So not a really concrete answer there, but it's about this sort of dialogue, and having events like this is super important in that.
Definitely. Thank you, Mr. Nissen. Mr. Tzib, if can we hear you as yet? Can we try? I think we seem to still have problems. We can always answer questions directed to Mr. Tzib through the comment section. I think that might be what we how we address that issue with the connection right now. All right, so we have a question from one of our directors at Heritage Education Network Belize, from Dr. Rebecca Freidel Juan. You are all doing such amazing work. I agree, definitely. I am wondering, Dr. Juan is wondering, what you, any of the presenters, see as the greatest challenge to conducting these collaborative heritage projects. The greatest challenge.
From my perspective, I would say like the greatest challenge has just been, well, definitely right now, traveling at all. So I know from maybe me and Zachary's perspective might be similar. It's just you can only collaborate so much when you can't actually be there with people. And then from my personal, it's just a lot of the challenges I've seen, and I think Frank is an attestament maybe against this, but like a lot of the traditional craftspeople that I know are older and in their older ages, and so that has become somewhat of an issue, just sharing that knowledge and making sure it gets written down and things like that is a challenge. It's just the reality of life, right? So those would be the two biggest things, I think.
So that brings up the opportunity for persons who are interested in heritage and culture to document those techniques, which on the one hand, Mr. Tzib is doing in San Antonio. So we need audience. We need a whole lot more of that from all over Belize. Let's move on to another question. What is being done to continue the exploration of other archaeological sites like Aventura that are not the focus of tourism? This question is from one of our viewers, Miguel Vanegas.
I can go ahead and jump in here. I would say that there's so much research being done in Belize all over the country. The Institute of Archaeology has done a really great job of ensuring that work is being done all over the country. And so I would say if you're not sure if a site is being worked at, near you, just reaching out to the IA. They're all over social media. Miss Sylvia, that's one of the directors here, is certainly a great contact person. So just looking for work that's being done out there, I am certain there is somewhere a site near you is being worked at. And just reaching out to people is a way of seeing that. I think one of the ways that events like this that are showing are that, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Archaeologists are more and more getting into sort of public engagement at the encouragement of the Institute of Archaeology. So attending events like this that we're seeing more of, and just encouraging and attending and supporting these types of events are ways to get that knowledge out there. And if you're not sure, and if you can't reach anyone, go ahead and reach out to me as well. And I can totally put you in contact with people that I know. But yeah, the Institute of Archaeology is the greatest resource to find out information about archaeological sites and the research that's being done at them. There's the annual Belize Archaeology Symposium that's held in San Ignacio. Unfortunately, the last 2 years that's been unavailable. But there are things out there and ways to get access to that information. It's just finding the right people to point you in the right direction is the issue.
And just to clarify for our viewers who might not know what IA stands for, IA is the Institute of Archaeology. All right, so we have a question from Sadie Hiron. Is there a place to view the process in San Antonio? I believe this question is directed to you, Mr. Tzib.
All right, so what about now?
Great, we can hear you now. So happy to have you back on.
All right, nice. We're having some little problems right now. Yes, as I mentioned before, in San Antonio, there is a place where I started to learn pottery, and it's the San Antonio Women's Cooperative. It's a group of women that have been like doing their own research as well. They've been doing like for years. They've been trying to learn the process about like pottery production in like specifically like Maya pottery production, and now they're given like tours, and now they're teaching people like the process like about Maya pottery in San Antonio. So in San Antonio, it's the woman cooperative that does that in San Antonio.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Tzib. We have another question here from Pablo Cal. How does a potter choose or select a clay to make their pots?
So as I mentioned before on my presentation, so we would collect clay that are mostly like on streams, like riverbanks, like on streams. So because like clay is impermeable, right? So when the water is washing, so it wash away like sediments of rocks or even like soil, that is not clay. So when it washes those sediments, then pure clay would stay there because it is impermeable. So in that way, like we would know that is pure clay because it's all the other sediments have been washed away. And sometimes we'll be tricked by that though. And there is where like we come in, like doing the kneading, and we try to play with the clay a little bit, like because it comes with experience. And you play with the clay, and then you try to bend the clay as we showed in the previous pictures. We were bent the clay. So the more you can bend the clay, the better the clay is. Because in that way, we can like shape the clay however we want, and then do the different figurines. So it all depends on the texture of the clay.
Okay.
Can I add to that as well?
Go ahead, please.
Just
Yes,
from my
right.
experience with like David and Estrella as well, you also have to think about like if your clay isn't pure, you have to think about how the other things are going to react to fire. And so a lot of times rocks and things like that will explode when they get too hot. And so if you don't want your pottery to be too weak or to kind of explode in the fire, you know, you do have to take out those bigger chunks. But sometimes you do want, like as Frank and Dr. Jordan said in their presentation, you do want some temper, some inclusions in there if you need to like make sure it holds water, make sure it doesn't hold water, things like that. So it really depends on the purpose of what you're using the pot for, right? But yeah, it's just an addition.
All right. Thank you for that. Very informative. We have a question from James. Oh, let's go ahead to Linsford Pop. The question reads, if there are many types of clay that were discovered to design clay pots, what are some that are currently used by ancient descendants for ancient ceramics? And is there a specific important type of clay? Any of you would like to take that question?
So in like in ancient times, I am even my grandfather mentioned that his ancestors, you know, his grandmother, even his grandmother used the type of clay that was called in Yucatec Maya he. So that is the type of clay that they use, and that has been passed on, you know, by my great grandmother. She taught her daughter where to get the clay, and on my grandfather, like he mentions that a lot. That now it's called the he. That is the specific clay that the Mayas used to create their ceramic pieces, you know. And yes.
All right. Thank you for that. And we are adding some vocabulary words there. So we have another question from James Mesh. Are community meetings held to inform communities of the findings at the archaeological sites? Specifically, if the site is within the boundaries of the community?
So I showed a couple slides of one of our main avenues of addressing the community around Shinantunich, which is the Sahuna Archaeological Outreach. Every year they have a fair, an archaeological and cultural fair, to kind of share what we've been finding, but also kind of introduce a lot of these, a lot of crafts and a lot of techniques that were used in ancient times to the people who live there, either asking them for their knowledge, their understanding of these crafts to share with the community, as David did in some of the photos I showed. But it also allows archaeological programs like Stan Creek and like the Mopan Valley Archaeological Project to like share what we've found in that season, so that that information doesn't kind of get lost in translation between what archaeologists are doing and how that affects people who actually live there, right? So that's one example, but I don't know in Northern Belize if you guys have a similar.
Yeah, every year that we're there, at least for those of us that work at Aventura, we do an Aventura Archaeology Day in the village of San Joaquin. And also while we're there, we'll work with the Corozal House of Culture to do events for Ancient World Week. And so both of those events are open to anyone to come, with the Corozal one being a full week of events. I've also done a few talks for like kids groups. So basically, when we're there, anyone that wants to know anything about what we're doing at Aventura, we try to squeeze that in addition to our sort of more formalized Ancient World Week and Aventura Archaeology Day events. But yeah.
All right, thank you. We have space. We have time for two more questions. Our next question comes from Alessandra Romero. Are the women who are currently teaching others the art of pottery planning to expand their sessions in other parts of the country? Or is it best for them to do it where the right clay can be found, like mentioned by the river?
So here in San Antonio, uh, unfortunately, we don't have any rivers. To find our clay, we have to go like outside San Antonio to find our clay. And the women's, I think it's better to leave it like they don't have any plans to extend their practices to other places around Belize, you know, because it's best to leave it like in San Antonio, because in a way like this is like promoting our village, you know, and the practices that have been done in our specific village for a long time. From my knowledge, I don't think there is any plans to extend their practices around Belize.
Okay.
I know David Nasea ran into a similar issue, I guess. Is that like in Succotz, they tried to get that like a stronger program going with other women that were in the village just to become self-sustainable. Like if you can make your own pottery, you don't have to import Tupperware and things like that from Guatemala or from elsewhere. You can become more financially independent. But I know that they ran into a lot of problems because they were, you know, people in the village don't have time to kind of, not time, but they don't, the resources that it would take to learn a new skill, go through the process, that kind of like trial and error process that comes with craft making. They found that a lot of times it was difficult because, you know, people have to support their families and they have to do things like this. So I think the effort is there. And I think that what Frank is saying obviously also makes sense, like to keep it within the village to as a source of pride maybe, or as a source of like identity, like we're San Antonio potters or we're Succotz potters. But I know in the specific case of Succotz, it was really hard just because of, you know, financial issues and the dependency on certain systems that are already established. To kind of break away from that and try to become more independent and more self-sustainable is really hard to get off the ground. So I think that that's an important thing to think about.
Okay, thank you for that response. We now move to our last question for this question and answer segment, and this one is from Louise Belanger. Have you been able to do any research into slips and oxides for coloring the pots?
So for my project, I am looking at slipped pottery specifically, like ancient slipped pottery. So I have looked into it a little bit. We actually did, and I think I saw this in Frank's presentation as well, so jump in if you would like. But we actually did put some aside to fire in what's called a reduced atmosphere. So actually, we do it in we did it in sawdust because that's how David does it. But it actually takes all of the oxygen out of the firing atmosphere by introducing smoke. He also said that they used to use the leaves of the gumbo limbo because they're very moist leaves, and the bark as well, and it creates a lot of smoke when you fire it. So by taking the oxygen out, it actually forces the slips to turn black. And so you can actually do this in certain patterned ways. And so some of the pottery that we see from ancient Maya actually do have what are called firing clouds. So there's these like spots of darker slips. And we think that it was sometimes unintentional, but it could have been an intentional way to design the pottery. So there's a really interesting kind of way to look at that as well. And even in the petrographic slides, like I showed, and the ones that Dr. Jordan has worked with as well, you can actually see a separate layer of slip if they've added it on as a design element. So you can start to study whether you can see the minerals in that. But it's really hard because it's super thin. So to answer that question, yes, there has been research, and there is research out there on that, but that's at least my experience with it.
Thank you, Ms. Villarreal. We will now end our question and answer segment here. Thank you, Mr. Nissen, Ms. Villarreal, and Mr. Tzib for joining us today. We will now be moving on to our short 10-minute coffee break, and we'll see you here in 10 minutes at 2 p.m. sharp to start our next segment for this afternoon. We'll be moving on to our coffee break, so go ahead and get your coffee, and we'll see you here at 2 p.m.
Nupubaticuetel, Tilebalobo, Tobetco Heritage Education Network, Tileyashking, Tileoshking, Lewinal Wo. Join us for the Culture Symposium from the 1st to the 3rd day of September. Heritage Education Network. Konesh Tulakalesh.
Cynthia, Ellis, Topsey.
And thanks for coming out to our
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you have your cup of coffee or tea or whatever works to keep you awake at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. We're back for our second segment, of the afternoon session. And in this session, we will focus on presentations that give us a glimpse into the archaeology of tomorrow. With the focus on digital technologies and pressing global issues such as climate change, we turn to new archaeological methods that can help us tackle the challenges of the 21st century. The following presentations will discuss technological advancements as well as traditional knowledge that will hopefully define the archaeology of tomorrow. First up, we have John Spenard and Mike Mirro. John Spenard is an archaeologist who has been studying the ancient Maya of the greater Belize Valley for most of the past 23 years. He began his studies as a field school student on the Western Belize Regional Cave Survey, where he became interested in learning more about Maya cave ritual practices and worldviews. He completed his dissertation research on the caves around the site of Pakbetun in the Cayo district. His current research project is on the archaeology of the mountain Pine Ridge, with a particular focus on the Rio Frio caves. We will now hear from John Spenard and co-presenter Mike Mirro about digital archaeology of the Rio Frio caves.
This afternoon. And also thank you to the Heritage Education Network Police for putting on this important event. We're actually really excited to be here, and I hope that this is one of the first of many KULCHA Symposia that we're going to come in the future. Now today what I want to do is talk to you about our research in the Rio Frio caves in the Cayo district, Belize. Now after a very brief introduction to the digital technologies that we use on the project, particularly photogrammetry and virtual reality tours, I'm actually going to demonstrate to you the technology and some of the results of this work by giving you a virtual site tour of the Rio Frio caves. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with the caves or where they're located, you can see they're here in central western Belize. And if we zoom in, we can take a closer look at the caves that we'll talk about today. Most people are familiar with Rio Frio Cave. This cave was actually called Rio Frio Cave C, and you can see that right here in the center of your screen. Now, on your way to Cave C, you might see a sign for the twin caves. That's Caves A and Caves B. And just before you get to them, going through Douglas de Silva, you'll probably see a sign for Closing Jaw. And then on your way to the Rio Frio Cave C, you might see a sign for Tunnel Cave, and that's located here. Now, there are two other caves known in the region that have been recorded. The first, it's Rio Frio Cave E, and my team hasn't been there yet, so I only have an approximation of where it's located. And the other was actually opened for tourism by forestry sometime in late 2018 or so, and that's Domingo Ruiz Cave. So today, in this talk, I will present to you Rio Frio Cave C, Cave A here. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, the Rio Frio caves were first recorded by an explorer adventurer, Gregory Mason, in 1928. Mason was sponsored by the High Foundation of New York City to go to Belize, then British Honduras, and Mexico and Guatemala to collect ethnographic materials. On that trip, though, he heard about some caves down south of Cayo that he was interested in exploring that was said to be filled with ancient artifacts. And so in 1928, after getting to Cayo, he made his way down the McCall River and up the Rio Frio, and he came across the three caves that he called Caves A, B, and C. Cave A and B are today known as the Twin Caves, like I just mentioned, and Cave C is the big cave that most folks know just simply as Rio Frio Cave. So he wound up collecting a pretty large quantity of artifacts, and I'll tell you a bit more about his research in the virtual tour coming up. But he very limited publications. He published this small monograph in 1928 that was basically an account of his trip, focusing on the caves, but it was really an adventure explorer journal. He talks about how deep and dark the caves are and scary and mysterious and all this. It's not a scientific report, but it is very well illustrated, and there's a lot of good plates in there showing the artifacts that he recovered. And he also wrote up his experiences in the caves in this other volume, larger volume that he wrote called South of Yesterday, and he dedicates a chapter, half of a chapter to his research in the caves. About 30 years later, A.H. Anderson heard of a cave being looted in the Mountain Pine Ridge in the Rio Frio region, and he went up there to investigate and record it before it was looted. And he actually had hoped to catch the person, the party responsible for the looting. He didn't, but he recorded 2 caves that he called Caves D and E. Now, Cave E is known today by some folks as Guatemala Cave. Right? Like I said before, my team hasn't been here yet, so I don't have much to say about that. Unfortunately, Anderson passed away just a few years after doing this research, doing this project here, and Hurricane Hattie has destroyed most of his notes about it and most of his collections. David Pendergast was able to salvage some of the research, and he wrote up a publication about this in 1970. And that's been it in the Rio Frio Caves until the start of my project, the Rio Frio Regional Archaeological Project, that I started in 2018. So the focus of the talk today is on the digital technologies we use on the riffraff. So what I'm going to do now is just give you a really brief overview and introduction to them and how they work, and then we'll go ahead and move on with the demonstration of the technology. Now, essentially, the technologies both work in the same way. We take a series of overlapping photographs. We use a digital DSLR camera. You can also use your cell phone, your smartphone to take photos. And as you can see here, we essentially just set up a tripod. Sometimes we have to improvise if the site's high up. This is a cave near Pacpatun. This is actually not in the Rio Frio region. But we set up a scene, and we move the tripod around the scene to produce a 3D model. And when it works, we're very happy. Now, to give you a quick demonstration of how this works and in this in action, this is a 3D digital model of a column that Mason talked about extensively in his write-up about the caves. And he said he wasn't sure if it was created by the Maya or not, but he studied it and studied it and studied it and spent time thinking about it and decided that it was in fact natural. But he wasn't wrong about some aspects of it, because it turns out that the ancient Maya did modify this. It is a natural column, but they did modify it. Now, if we zoom in here, we can actually see that there used to be formations right here, and these have actually been chopped away. And so the ancient Maya actually they modified this column to basically create a visage. Now, really the only safe places to stand and on this ledge, there's a drop of several meters here down to a chamber down below, and there's a bigger ledge over here, but we didn't capture it in this model. Really, the only place that people would have been able to stand would have been basically from where we're looking at this now, and they would have been here using torches. And so you can imagine torchlight. This is well lit because we have a lot of video lights in this chamber lighting this up. Torchlight, though, would have been much darker, and it would have projected a shadow that would have cast onto the wall. It would have cast a shadow of this visage onto the wall, and the torchlight would have made it bounce around. And so, in essence, what they did up here was to create a theatrical production that showed the manifestation of probably some kind of supernatural being, or perhaps the Earth Lord, down to people who would have been watching in the chamber down below. But we can get an idea of, we can navigate around and see what the column looked like from different angles with this technology. All right, welcome back. So that was photogrammetry. To create virtual tours, we essentially do the same thing, but instead of moving the camera around the scene, we put the tripod in the middle of the scene that we want to shoot, and we use a special panoramic head on the tripod that allows us to take 360-degree photos. And so we create a photosphere that we then can compile and put them in a series to create a virtual tour. And so I'll show you that technology and how we integrate photogrammetry and other media into our project as a way of continuing studying these sites, but also as a way of presenting them to interested audiences like you. All right, welcome to the Rio Frio Caves. Now, one of the things I want to point out really quickly is that if you listen carefully, you can hear sounds of the jungle in the background. And so what I'm able to do is record audio of this ambiance, and I'm able to embed that in these. So what you're seeing here is actually a photosphere. And we can watch as it moves around. And we get to see Rio Frio Cave. This is the Rio Frio. And we're about to see the entrance of the cave. Now I have this set to auto rotate right now. However, I can stop it, and I can also navigate around. So you can see how big the cave is. These are tree roots coming down from 60 meters up above. So you can look directly overhead. And we can look straight down on the ground. And through the program we use, we can actually get rid of the tripod that we use. All right, so we go into the cave here, and this is primarily the tourist part of the cave. So the parking lot's up over here, people come up staircase here, and then there's this ledge here. And here's me for scale right here. Zoom in. Okay, that's me for scale. So this ledge here is the primary place where tourists visit, as well as the beach down the bottom here. But I want to point out some of the things that we can do here is pull up information. So here I write up information and tie it to a particular area. So here, this is a quote I pulled from Mason's report on this cave. And he says, along the cave wall, one could tread nowhere without stepping on sherds, in other words, ceramics. The majority are rough common sherds, but many bear incised designs, and not a few are decorated with patterns and colors, usually red, black, and yellow, or red and black and orange. For people who have been at the cave today, when you go up here, it's completely barren of artifacts. And so this has been over the last century, these have been removed. But here's some of the pieces that Mason has published. So here's some incised designs. Here's some of the polychrome pieces right here. So we'll go to the front of the cave now, and we'll head up to the twin cave, Rio Frio Cave A. Now this is the cave that my team and I have spent most of our time investigating. And here's just a picture showing us at a day of work. So we've been primarily focusing our investigations on the entrance of Cave A. And so I'll take you down here really quick and show you some of the things that we've found. Now our focus has been on this, one of our foci has been on this area of the cave here because of the ceramic scatter right here. And you see all these square and triangular pieces. These aren't rocks, those are actually ceramics. And what we wanted to do is learn when the cave was being used, and we can use ceramics to learn that. And so being that there's a high concentration of artifacts, we excavated here to get ceramics that we can stylistically date to learn when the cave was investigated. Now you can see here in our excavation unit, this white here is actually a series of ash lenses. So there's a lot of burning here. And you can hear excavation noises in the background. We found several baby corn cobs in that excavation unit. And what that tells us is that this was actually probably a place where ancient Maya people were coming and performing agricultural rituals. So they would collect some of the earliest fruits from their milpas or from their fields and bring them here as thanks to the Earth Lord for providing bountiful harvests. Well, that's certainly not all there is to see of the Rio Frio caves. We hope you enjoyed this really quick introduction to them and some of the work that we're doing there, especially with the digital technologies. We're really excited to do this research, and we're happy that it's able to provide some firsthand experiences of these sites for everybody. Thanks again to the Heritage Education Network Belize for hosting this conference, and we look forward to hearing your questions soon. And you can follow us on Facebook, Facebook, Instagram, or our website. Thanks. Take care.
Next up, we have Dr. Anabel Ford and Miss Cynthia Ellis Topsey. Dr. Anabel Ford, a Maya archaeologist, decoded the ancient Maya landscape by combining archaeological survey with traditional knowledge. Admiring the local knowledge of the Maya forest, when she encountered El Pilar, a major Maya city linking Belize and Guatemala, she envisioned a place of monument discovery in the context of the traditional knowledge of the people living in the region today. She recognized the Maya forest garden as a relic of traditional land use, accounting for ancient Maya settlement patterns. She brings her extensive field experience and broad inquisitive mind to demystify the Maya. Miss Cynthia Ellis Topsey, on the other hand, is a community advocate who works to promote sustainable development by building on the achievements of previous generations for future generations. Much of Miss Ellis Topsey's professional experience centers around placing women and families at the center of sustainable development. Most notable as the founder and director of the Belize Rural Women's Association and a facilitator for the United Nations at the Annual Commission on the Status of Women. Recently, she has worked on the El Pilar 4 Pillars project to study cultural preservation and support conservation of the El Pilar Archaeological Reserve for Maya flora and fauna by highlighting Maya conservation methods. Miss Ellis Topsey is also working on a memoir recounting her life's accomplishments. We will now hear from Dr. Anabel Ford and Miss Cynthia Ellis Topsey about Kanan Kash Model Garden as action for climate change.
Greetings. Cynthia Ellis Topsey and I, Anabel Ford, are presenting on the Kanankash School Garden and how to address climate change with the ancient Maya and traditional Maya landscape model we call the Milpa cycle. We have to think about the heritage of the ancient Maya and realize that they come from a past that was skilled with stone and fire. That these people that came across more than 12,000 years ago rapidly came as hunters and gatherers with these skills, and they adapted to a very dramatic amount of climate change. And we have a lot to learn from their experience. What they left us is a vital Maya forest, diverse, one of the most biodiverse in the world, with 20 dominant plants that serve almost every kind of need that any human being, family, culture would need, with food, fodder, products, latex, poison, construction, medicine. And this Maya forest, it's a forest, so it's pollinated largely by animals, insects, moths, bees, bats, but only one plant, the breadnut tree, Brossima malacastrum, is pollinated by wind. It is a pioneering type of tree, so obviously wind would be helpful to pollinate it. The others, when you're in the forest, it's hard to meet another tree. So these trees are a biodiverse complex, making it a hotspot, but it's the co-creation of the Maya, the dynamic milpa cycle, and the impact today is threatened by the ecological imperialist of pasture and plow. This is an image of pasture and plow, but the Maya forest was managed by people who used hand technology, did not use plows, and used their knowledge, their traditional knowledge, to create a dynamic landscape that would have open spaces for crops, would have closed spaces for fruit, and would have management in between them, forest and fields. Today, it's the pasture and plow that mark the boundary between Mexico and Guatemala, this international Maya forest of Belize, Guatemala, and Mexico. And really, it's the creative biodiversity strategies, the intimate knowledge of the landscape that really will give a vital future to this landscape. To explore solutions past and to really engage these wonderful traditional farmers, we have they have helped create El Pilar as the reserve for Maya flora and fauna. They have seen it embrace both Belize and Guatemala binational. We have parallel management plans that we are developed with the help of the community. And now with their help, we're taking their strategies and engaging with students, ourselves included, with their fruitful landscape. But that landscape has really been very impacted by this idea of clean. Even in 1552, more than 500 years ago, or about 500 years ago, they passed ordinances against the strategy that was going to be the life breath of every family there. And it has survived. And as this milpa cycle is managed with short-term annuals, fast-growing perennials, and close canopy trees that all are useful. It's a cycle that has come across decades and centuries and millennia, a practice that has to be learned by walking. It can't be found in an encyclopedia. In fact, the polycultural landscape that we're talking about of trees, of forest, really starts with the outfield, milpas, where all the same plants, shrubs, herbs, tubers, grasses, palms, vines, and trees are there under the canopy of the maize, but are nurtured as forests in the home gardens like you see here. Home garden where all the trees and also sun to make those wonderful chiles that we want. Starts with burning you can see there are trees in this landscape, and there are cut trees that are cut in a way that they can resprout, hastening the forestry, the succession components that we're talking about. Planting in this field, it's a rocky place, no place for a plow. But no sooner is it growing than we see up to 30 different crops growing. Here we can see the maize and the squash Here we can see the beans. It looks like a dead field, but actually all the maize is on the stalks, and the beans are growing up the stalks. And when it gets to be time to be hastening into the perennials here, perennials are shading the trees that are going to be the forest garden in the future. And here is an orchard that shows how the fast-growing perennials still encourage the forbs, the different herbs, and you can even see the fast-growing plants in there too. This is what the animating the milpa cycle at El Pilar looks like. El Pilar is this wonderful living museum, and we could actually envision it much more dynamically in the past with this fields. The yellow is the milpa open field. Succession growing is a little darker green, and the darker green is the canopy, mature canopy in a field of many different forests. Really giving you an idea how dynamic this landscape really is to feed all the people of the city of El Pilar. How are we honoring it? My goodness. Here is what Catherwood saw in 1830 and what we see today. I don't know, gravity, not a good idea, not just a good idea, it's the law. How can it look like that? That's really going beyond imagination. And here we can see the original 1972, how this mask looked. Can't even see it in 2012. Sobering facts: exposure creates stresses and attracts biofilms. The biofilms are that which make the wonderful soil that's created out of the limestone wonderful for the trees and the milpa cycle, but not for destroying the monuments. We need to know those monuments as well. And we argue that we really want to see it as a living museum designed to frame these beautiful monuments, and using the canopy to shelter both humans in the present and the monuments of the past, using the knowledge with the community participation, looking at one resource in the case of El Pilar in 2 countries, advancing this concept of a peace park initiative, framing the monuments with the forest, creating a new aesthetic, inviting exploration, embracing culture and nature, and really seeing these monuments in context of the environment that they were created in, shading visitors and appreciating the forest. But this is a time to really reckon with climate change. Of course, shade is wonderful. Temperature is rising, and we're seeing much more precipitation chaos in the world today. Just like in the past, here's the precipitation chaos that caused the emergence of the Maya forest garden. You can see present here with all the herbs and different kinds of trees, not just the lack of Ramon, but the presence of the whole cycle. And this cycle is action to address climate change. It builds fertility, reduces erosion, lowers temperature, conserves water, increases biodiversity, all caring for people on our planet. These are the heroes of the Maya forest. They are vital, but as you can see, they are dying, and with each death, it's greater than an encyclopedia. It is an entire practice that we're losing. We need to really figure out a way, and we have offer our Kanankash, where we say no child is left indoors. We want to bring skill, practice, and knowledge forward. We want to see the succession of that with the school program, with the importance of trees, relevance of tradition, impact of climate. It's a model for all schools where it can be initiated with forest gardeners, have workshops for teachers, and environmental lessons for all of us students. And this can be done. Here is my brass base in Cayo, and just 2 years later, how many trees are really there, and what it is we can develop urban gardens thanks to our collaborators. And we can engage these master forest gardeners who are really the treasures of the wealth untold, and can really tell us how to flourish under the shade. In fact, El Pilar can be that living museum with your help, and an educational destination that will draw visitors into the experience, and really have something we call archaeology under the canopy. And here's just a view of what you can see when you go to El Pilar with the map. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ford, for that very informative presentation. Next up, we have Professor Lisa Lucero. Lisa Lucero is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and a professor of anthropology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her interests focus on the emergence and demise of political power, ritual, water management, the impact of climate change on society, sustainability of tropical regions, and the classic Maya. She has been conducting archaeology projects in Belize for 30 years. Dr. Lucero uses insights from the Maya on tropical sustainability issues, relying on what she has learned from traditional Maya ecological knowledge. We will now hear from Professor Lisa Lucero about the heritage of Maya traditional ecological knowledge.
Hello. First, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this symposium. I'm really excited about it. My name is Lisa Lucero, and I have been working in Belize for over 30 years. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to come to Belize since the pandemic started, so hopefully in 2022. So today I'm going to talk about the heritage of Maya traditional ecological knowledge. And a lot of this knowledge, of course, comes from the archaeological record, but a lot of it also comes from working with Maya. All of my Maya associates and foremen are Maya from different backgrounds. And I've learned so much from them working with them in the field, because when we find stuff, when we excavate or we're surveying, they teach me so much about the surrounding jungle, the soils, the weather, when it's going to rain, and so on. So a lot of this is due to them, and it helps me interpret the past because they are the descendants of the Maya, and their ancestors have been living here for thousands of years, and so there's a lot to learn from Maya knowledge as well as from the archaeological record, and together they provide an excellent source of materials to help us move on in the future for our own sustainable practices. And I have permission to use this photo of the Chok family in the Valley of Peace. Cleofo on the far right is one of my foremen. So there are over 7 million Maya living today, speaking to their sustainable existence. They've been sustainably farming for 4,000 years without massive deforestation, even in the past, which I'll talk about. Now, one of the major issues to keep in mind is, as in the past, the Maya today and people living the non-Maya today, in tropical regions like the Maya area, it's rainfall dependent. So you'll have seasonalities. You have a rainy season and a dry season. And the issue with that, of course, is that, you can't predict how much, or if there's too much or not enough. During the dry season, it becomes a green desert. There are tropical storms, hurricanes, and water quality issues. When there's daily needs to take into account hydration, cooking, ceramic and plastic manufacture in the past, and similar issues and needs today. And one of the interesting things and amazing things about tropical regions is that they have a high biodiversity. And this soil map put together by Scott Feddick and his team at UC Riverside mirrors the diversity. I mean, this is a soil map that reflects productivity for agriculture, which is great, but it also mirrors the diversity of different kinds of flora and fauna, because it also is a very much of a mosaic pattern. You don't have massive clusters of the same species. Even though there's high biodiversity, everything is spread out. And so this soil map is very useful for us as archaeologists, but it's also very useful to get a sense of this diversity in terms of resources in everything. And so the blue dots are settlements, whether they be one mound or a small center. And so what we see here is we see very dense settlement near the Carablanca Lakes here. And then in the center, less dense settlement near the cenotes, which is, I argue, is a pilgrimage destination. Now, one of the reasons that the Maya have done so well that I've learned from them, their ecological record, is how they engage with the non-human world. I don't have much time to talk about the inclusive worldview I've written about, and if you're interested, I can send you a PDF. But it's how they engage with the non-human world in terms of it's much more of an inclusive worldview, so everything exists on the same plane, and everyone has a role to maintain that world. And this impacts how the Maya work with the forest, work with animals, and work with everything. And so today we call it forest management. I think it's more of a collaboration. And then Gomez de Pompas argued that the forest we see today is a descendant forest representing this forest management. And so one of my former students, Colleen Lindsay, and Cleofo did all of these survey maps, but they collected all these botanical specimens to assess this. And they collected over 300 different species in 40 meter diameter plots in areas between Yalbak and Cara Blanca. And Cleofo identified about 95% of them, as well as animals and other kinds of things, birds and reptiles. So his knowledge of the jungle is amazing. I can't emphasize this enough. It truly is amazing. And, so he identified 95% of them. And those he identified, all of them had some kind of use, whether they're medicinal, poisons, food, construction materials, and so on. Everyone had a use. Those that he could not identify, they were just plants in the sense that because they did not have a use, for the Maya anyway. They had uses for other entities in this world, other flora and fauna kinds of things. And so this is just one of these plots, these 40 meter diameter plots. And this happens to be near a house mound near the medium-sized center of Yalbak. And this is a kilometer, I forgot the length of this, 500 meter wide or 400 meter wide transect that Andrew Kinkala did for his dissertation. So these are the different plots they did between Yalbak and Cara Blanca. So the other numbers represent different species. So you see a lot of fours here, for example, to give you a sense of the biodiversity we see today. And to reflect this biodiversity in soils and other things, it's not surprising that the Maya relied on and continue to rely on various strategies using different scales, from slash and burn to intensive agricultural strategies and subsistence strategies, raised fields, the reliance on aguadas, terraces throughout. So it's very localized because the soils and the rainfall patterns are very localized. So thus subsistence strategies are very localized in terms of water and agricultural systems, which should not come as any surprise. And this is also reflected in milpas and forest gardens. They mimic the diverse forests. So here, this is, and again, I have permission to use this is a chalk garden. And what you have here is a map of his house lot that Colleen did with Cleofa's assistance. And all the numbers represent different foods, medicines, household items, like to make brooms, poisons, to kill fish, construction materials, ornamental flowers, and palm leaves, this kind of thing. So to non-Maya eyes, it might look like a disorganized garden, but every plant has a purpose. You see bird peppers here and mint, and this actually is an old log that they use to churn butter. So everything has a use. Everything is recycled. Everything is reused. There's multiple purposes for everything. Okay, so everything is diverse. And diversity is really a key. And yet the Maya still relied on forest products, not only in terms of construction materials, but for game, for protein, and ornamental purposes, bird feathers and beautiful flowers. And then also they fished. These two images are from the web, the tapir and the fer-de-lance. The rest are images my team and I've taken over the years, again, to show this diversity. And the thing about keystone species is that when you find a species, a certain kind of species, a keystone species, you know the forest is healthy because a keystone species represents a species that indicates that there's a whole line of flora and fauna that are that this keystone species rely on, and that they also, the keystone species, rely on them. So it's this, this very beneficial relationship for everything. So when you find various keystone species in the archaeological record, you know there are nearby healthy biodiverse forests, because most animals can only breed and mature in the forest. So because, as you know, the Maya did not domesticate many animals, the dog and the stingless bees, and a type of turkey, not the ocellated turkey, and they did tame other animals, perhaps the Muscovy duck, that increasingly scholars show came up actually from the south, and so on. So they did have tame animals, but they can only breed in the wild. Zoos even today still have problems breeding. That's why it makes headline news when, a zoo successfully breeded blah, X, whatever, because it's so challenging. So when we find, again, evidence of keystone species in the archaeological record, we know about the sustainability and how they interact with other entities, which is important. Another type of management that the Maya did were through pilgrimage destinations, because they did not build cities, for example, in these areas. And, like Carablanca, in those cenotes I briefly mentioned, we don't find any houses or evidence for agricultural fields. The only evidence we find are for ceremonial structures. So cross-culturally, a lot of people leave these areas untouched. So they're like no man's land. You can't hunt, you can't collect. All you can do is go there and, pray and make offerings to the gods and ancestors. And in so doing, it allows flora and fauna to flourish, and which is a type of conservation, another type of collaboration, another type of management. And this is quite different than what we're seeing presently in tropical areas, including the Maya area, where you have industrial agriculture, which are not taking into account Mayan traditional knowledge, which I think is very detrimental to tropical areas in the long term as well as short term. So this is from the lookout on the Yabok Ranch property, which has recently been sold to a consortium of conservation groups. And so pre-hurricane in 2009, it was just that you could look out over the Carablanca pools looking south, and pre-hurricane, and then post-hurricane, there's much more dryness. I know it's sort of hard to see, but then because of all the trees the Hurricane Richard killed in October 2010, during the dry season you had massive fires, and that's the post-fire. And so Yalbach Ranch sold off the properties to Spanish Lookout Mennonite Corporation, which are in the process of clear-cutting, thousands of acres. And all the white dots, of course, are ancient Maya farmsteads and structures and the like. So I think if there's can be a happy medium between industrial agriculture and Maya traditional farming practices, we wouldn't have to see this massive. And these are some of the excavation units. And I was awarded a 3-year National Science Foundation grant to do salvage archaeology, and it was supposed to start in 2020. Alas, unfortunately, that was postponed due to the pandemic, and postponed again in 2021, so hopefully 2022. So what I argue, and again, if you're interested in either of these PDFs, you can just email me. But I talk about this cosmocentric worldview where everyone's on the same plane, not necessarily equal, versus anthropocentrism, which has resulted in us trying to tame nature, which has led to the Anthropocene, versus working with nature, and you get a millennia of sustainable living. So there's a lot that we can learn from this more cosmocentric worldview and how it is manifested in agricultural and forest management practices. So some of the lessons we can learn are that diversity is key, change how we engage with the natural world, an inclusive worldview that does not privilege humans, And this would impact how we collaborate with the forest and, conservation areas, national parks, mimic forest diversity more in gardens and in fields, get away from monocropping, work with local stakeholders to learn about this traditional environmental knowledge. And others that I did not discuss in this talk, and if you're interested, I have some publications on it. And this is, labor versus technology, something Vern Scarborough writes about, more labor-intensive project rather than relying on technology, recycle and reuse more. I didn't have time to talk about green cities, but everything is based on local resources for the most part. I mean, a lot of mostly it's only luxury items that are traded long distance. And, so they worked with their own water supplies, their own agricultural supplies, and, this local resource networks, which is something we can emulate. The clean water, the reservoirs were constructed wetlands, and I've written on this if you're interested. And we can turn some of our swimming pools into constructed wetlands, just like the reservoirs. And organic waste. There's the Chases estimate based on their work at Caracol that only 10% of people are actually buried in house floors or in tombs. What about the other 90%? They're probably natural burials. Ethnographically, they have evidence of where people are buried in the forest and they plant a tree over them. So the lesson is that we have to adapt because conditions will not change, so we must. And thank you.
Thank you for that informative presentation, Professor Lucero. We will now move on to the interactive part of this segment, the question and answer period. So I invite to the fore Professor Lisa Lucero, Dr. Anabel Ford, Miss Cynthia Ellis Topsey, Mr. John Spenard, and Mr. Mike Mirro. Remember, everyone, that you can drop your questions into the comment section on our Facebook or YouTube pages. You can find our pages by searching Heritage Education Network Belize. Thank you for being here with us, presenters. So let's get into this. We will search for our questions. We have our first question from Ingwer Seeloff. This one is directed to Dr. Anabel Ford. The question is the original idea of the Maya Forest Garden a role model in relationship with the climate change? Or just an illusion when you see what happened to Maya society and nature? Dr. Ford?
Well, I'd like to ask Cynthia. Maybe she might have a response. But basically, I'm not capturing everything. But I believe that the Maya Forest Garden was practiced all the way from like Lisa said, 4,000 years ago. They began to respond to climate changes, and the Milpa Forest Garden system evolved to manage climate, manage land cover. Respond and work with nature, and we can see people today and the people that Cynthia left. Well, maybe she'll come back on, but maybe he couldn't reword the question, or I didn't answer it, or I did. I don't know.
Thank you, Dr. Ford. Just a gentle reminder, can we keep our mics muted until you are called to respond, please? That's just to avoid echo. So we have another question here, this one from Ali Villarreal. The question reads, with climate change and increased temperatures, large storms and weather fluctuations, how do you see that affecting future efforts on conservation? How do you see that affecting future efforts on conservation as well as collaborative projects? Can any of you can go ahead and answer that question?
Well, I see collaboration with traditional forest gardeners as a way to reduce temperature and to mediate the impacts of large storms, because you need to have trees to distribute water, roots to collect water, and hold in the erosion. In fact, forest gardening would be a really good collaborative project to address temperatures, of course, shade, etc. Cynthia, do you have a remark?
Shade, etc. Cynthia, do you have a remark?
Yes, I do. Can I be heard? I'm just having challenges technologically. Am I being heard?
Yes, we can hear you.
Am I being heard?
Yes, we can hear you, Miss Topsey.
Yes. First of all, I want to congratulate.
Yes, we can, Miss Topsey.
I just want to first of all congratulate all the presenters and Anabel Ford in particular. I had the opportunity to visit University of California, Santa Barbara. It was a phenomenal experience. And as a community activist and a Belizean, that our Maya forest gardeners are being celebrated by that university. And our Dr. Narciso Torres, who is one of the forest gardeners who Dr. Ford had as her team from the outset, will be given the highest award from the university, which is Chancellor's Medal. And that is a testimony of respect, honor, and appreciation, as it shows to also an indigenous and we learning from the Maya Forest Garden across all ethnic groups in Belize. So I just wanted to celebrate that point and to indicate that our movement of taking the knowledge of forest gardening and the Maya forest gardening approach to the rest of the country and all ethnic groups and the world is a powerful one. And we have recently signed a memorandum of understanding with the Niche and Museum of Belize, where we are going to influence curriculum for schools, not only in Belize, but in the world. So I'm very excited about this work as a Belizean, and also in honor of my ancestral husband, Harriet Topsey, who was the Archaeological Commissioner of Belize, who transitioned 20 years ago. And I also want to acknowledge Dr. Joseph Palacio, who was the first Belizean archaeologist in the country of Belize. So I'm very excited about this space that we have created to participate in this movement, where we will inspire, hopefully, many researchers locally and internationally to join hands to address these issues of climate change, food sovereignty, construction, many such issues. So thank you for this platform to do so. But we don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Thank you, Miss Cynthia Ellis Topsey, for that response.
Thank you,
It seems that there are some technological issues that we are having with your connection. Therefore, I suggest that you turn off the camera. That can help to increase the to better the connection, and also a gentle reminder to turn off the microphone while others are speaking, so that we can prevent the echo. So we have another question, and this one is directed to John. Can you discuss a little bit more about how photogrammetry is used to document other archaeological features, such as rock shelters and chultuns? Do you have plans for increasing accessibility of the digital archaeology? John?
Sure. Thanks, Ali, for that question. So we've actually experimented with a couple of different procedures for creating digital models of caves and rock shelters. Surprisingly, in my research, I've only come across a few Schultoons, and this was before we were doing the photogrammetry on the site. So I don't have much experience with there, but I think the process would be pretty similar. But we've tried photogrammetry in larger caves, and there's a couple of drawbacks to that process. One is because we're using digital photographs and we're using high resolution digital photographs, the models get unwieldingly large really quick. And so in terms of documenting a cave, a larger cave with it, it becomes really problematic. And so that's why we started using the photospheres, because it gives you the same kind of ability to walk through the cave. And what we can do is make 3D models of features that we want to highlight more, and we can actually embed them into the into a virtual tour, like I showed during my talk there. And so you can navigate around in 360 degrees, like it was the Google Street View. It's basically the same technology there. And so we can with the 3D tour, with the virtual tours, we can embed a lot more information in there. And I just showed us a small sample of it during the talk. So hopefully that answers the first part of your question. Just looking at it again here. Plans for increasing accessibility. Do you mean in terms? I'm assuming you're going to mean access to the models. So I do post them on my project website, and I'm working on the virtual tour still. There's some technological issues. I'm not a web developer, but I do run the website myself. So that's learning how to do that still. So that's still something I hope to do. But I have many 3D models posted through my project website. We have a Sketchfab website as well for the project, where we post some of the models as well, some artifacts there. Still building a lot of this. The project only started in 2018, and obviously we only got a few short seasons in before COVID shut us down. So this is a project that continues to be built. But yeah, my one of the things that I really appreciate about this technology is that it does make it more accessible as long as you have an internet connection.
Thank you, John. We have another question coming in, this one from Miguel Venegas. How impactful can implementing ideas like Maya Forest Garden be when there are powerful external players that set the rules in agriculture? It's a very interesting question. Dr. Ford?
Just have to get that thing. Actually, there is a agroforestry policy being evaluated in government now, and I see that as a potential way to recognize the contemporary master forest gardeners as cues. It's not an idea. We're not talking about an idea. We're talking about things that people are actually doing. And largely all over the world, 90% of the food comes from smallholders. So we really could have a very amazing transformation by simply recognizing these incredible intellectual talents that we have in rural settings, rather than calling them horrible, slash and burn, giving pejorative things, saying it's destroying the forest. Look at all the resources. Lisa was talking about all the resources in that yard, you know, and you can imagine how vital these things could be. Also, it would, as I said in that other question, if you look at our 5 points, I mean, this will reduce temperature with shade. It will increase biodiversity, or at least maintain it. It will reduce erosion by simply having varied landscape. It will increase fertility of soil by simply having more organics. It is not an idea. It's something that's happening all over, except those people who are getting older are not being followed. We need to follow it. That picture of the Mennonite corporation expanding techniques that, you know, you don't know if they've killed how many animals living in the trees, tinamou living in the forest on the ground, nests, sentinel mahoganies that are just knocked down, some rare species we don't even know. Indeed, the whole thing, and it's all, when they do that, they bunch it all up and either rescue it and get this thing from a permit from natural resources for scavenging wood. And in fact, this is a depredation of all the woods around, because they are taking illegal woods from El Pilar down to Spanish Lookout, because there's no control. It's all rescued salvage. If they simply eliminated anchor chains and stopped giving salvage permits, we would probably have more forest, because that's going to be, it's those kinds of clearings. I mean, rescue archaeology aside, those kinds of clearings are going to impact the river, going to impact the disposition of eroded soil. Obviously, those things are going to bring petrochemicals. Those are going to go into the river. Good news, we live up in Cayo, not in Belize City, because all those toxins are going to go on down there. If we don't get a grip, it will be writ large. The idea isn't an idea, it's there. We just need to give it the higher priority.
Thank you, Dr. Ford, for that insight. Professor Lucero, is there anything you might like to add?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Anabel made some excellent points. And one of the things, too, is that the best way one of my ideas is actually to work with Mennonites, because I remember when I got permission in 2016 to do the first year of salvage archaeology in this recently cleared area, he, laid down the rules, so to speak. And one thing he said that stuck with me is like, we're not into tree hugging like my daughter. And I'm like, oh, okay, your daughter, which means likely other youth, the Spanish Lookout youth. And so part of the plan is to invite families or interested Mennonites to help us excavate and, to learn about what they are excavating and why they're living there and this kind of thing. And also a large parcel of land, over 300,000 acres in central Belize, just north of that area, north of the SPLC property, was recently purchased by a consortium of conservation groups, and it's going to be managed by the Belize Maya Forest Trust. And the majority of shareholders in this are in Belize, which is great. I am a member as an archaeologist who works in the area, but everyone else, they're environmentalists, government officials, landowners, scientists, and it's really wonderful. So this is this working and collaborating. I talked about my collaboration with the forest. It's also collaboration with, people you don't necessarily agree with, or that, this conservation, we have a conservation action plan meeting tomorrow. It's a new thing for me, but I can't wait to see how we can help each other and involve, and also Maya are members as well. So I'm really excited about that. And I think it's about just collaboration.
Thank you for that response, Professor Lucero. It helps to reframe some of what we might be thinking or might be experiencing. Our next question is from Miriani Coy, and her question is, why must we act urgently on climate change? How do you propose we stop climate change, or is it hopeless?
We're not stopping climate change. Do you know that when the first people entered into the Maya area, it was pretty much the Ice Age. So climate is changing. What we have to do is know how to be flexible and resilient under these things. We're not going to, it's neither hopeless nor hopeful. It's a reality check. And it's just basically the reason why it's really not climate is changing all the time. It really bothers me when people say, oh, the cows are dying, or, the fires, we have lots of fires here. All these are aspects of management. In fact, the milpa cycle, which burns, let's just say 1/5 of the landscape every year for a 4-year investment in annuals as you build towards perennials, that might actually be a fuel strategy. It reduces fuel because if you don't permit fires, you build fuel and therefore accentuate fires. And fire management, basically knowing how to use fire. So anyway, I don't think we're gonna, you can act or not act. It's not urgent or unurgent. The reason why it's a problem now or appears urgent or perhaps hopeless is because we have altered the landscape so much everywhere. So what we have to do is really look, are we going to do short-term profits, like I would say clearing the forest at the Mennonite area, or are we going to look at long-term stability? And, I don't think people invest in stocks, let's just go invest in Sears. It was a solid system. It's crumbling. You're one source, but if you diversify, and that's what the Maya Forest Garden really is, if you diversify, you will actually result in something that will both manage the land, manage the forest, manage the temperature, manage erosion, and provide, as Cynthia was mentioning, food sovereignty right there in Belize.
Thank you, Dr. Ford. Professor Lucero or Mr. Spenard, would you like to add any thoughts?
I would. Basically, yes, climate's always changing, but since the advent of the Industrial Revolution, or even since the advent of agriculture, we have increased the input of CO2 and increased greenhouse gases, which traps in more heat. So we are exacerbating natural cycles of climate change. And even if we dropped our CO2 emissions enough to make a difference, it's still going to take 50 to 100 years. So we do have to respond. So I agree with Anabel. It's not a case of hopeless or too hopeful. It's a question of acknowledging and recognizing that we are in the Anthropocene, and it's not just about land clearing. It's about climate change as well, because the more land you clear, the warmer it gets as well, because the albedo effect, the more deforestation that happens, it exposes the ground surface, which absorbs heat, which increases land temperatures and temperatures near the surface, but also decreases rainfall. And trees also, absorb CO2 and promote, generate the production of oxygen. So yeah, trees and any kind of greenery is really important. But so I do think that people need to acknowledge that climate change is happening, and it is, most of it, the extreme nature of it is the direct result of human action over the last 300, 200 years kind of thing. And so we need to change it. We need to rethink how we engage with the world on an individual basis, local basis, community basis, city basis, state, national, and global. And so it's actually intersecting all these different levels. That is the critical thing to do. So it's top down versus and bottom up. And I mean, I'm taking this I'm teaching climate change in Tzib this semester. It's a gen ed class, so I have all these stats, right now. But yeah, it's something that we do need to acknowledge, and we can't put our head in the sand, for sure.
Thank you, Professor Lucero. Our next question is from Ingwer Seeloff, and the question reads, what are the right steps to get the young generation involved in the tradition of forest gardening? Having so many offers, the youth might be more interested in.
This is, of course, we're missing Cynthia, who would certainly have something more profound to say on this, as her arena. But the fact is that we need to think a little bit wider. Okay, you don't have to, not everyone has to participate as a forest gardener, but if we have rural people rural youth who are wanting to, go into business, everything isn't computers. They could actually be a middle person, identify good farmers, that maybe even their parents, and provide good and safe resources from forest gardens to the market, for example, to tourism, to anything. There's lots of people who would want good food. So I mean, if we want to promote good food and good land management and advantage the smallholder and encourage the traditional ecological knowledge that is really vanishing with each death. It's not like something, this is a practice. You can't just go out and pick up a book and learn how to, Microsoft Word it, it's something you have to walk in the footsteps. And so maybe not everyone wants to be a gardener, but I certainly know lots of people that do. And I don't know about the youth in general, but there's got to be people who feel a calling to plant. And also, this is a place where you don't have to stamp a time card, but you do have to recognize and learn how to be observant. I feel that there are really a lot of opportunities, but we have to think a little bit broader in how they are promoted.
Thank you, Dr. Ford. We have another youth-related question, and this question reads, how can youth get involved with photogrammetry and other archaeological technological advancements? I think this question is for John. John, do you have any insight?
Sure, it's a really good question. There are several different platforms that are affordable, really, at this point. My initial reaction was when this digital technology first started. Photogrammetry has been used for a long time, but digitally it's sort of undergoing a revolution now in archaeology, and it's becoming much more common. It was the programs to make the 3D models, especially, were really prohibitively expensive, especially for somebody who is not in education. But there's several different companies now, including a few, at least one that I know of, and I'll have to think more about the name of it. I don't have it off the top of my head. Where you can upload the photos and process the models online, and then you pay a nominal fee depending on the digital size of the model. So how many pictures you take, etc. And we're talking a few cents to maybe $1 or so to produce some larger models. So really, all you need to start is a camera, and then it's learning. You improve your photography skills. You can improve your. You just experiment with the technology, see what works, what doesn't work in terms of how many pictures you need to take. And if anybody wants to contact me, I can direct you to a few more sources online that that talk specifically about procedures for this. So really, it can be as simple as if you can push a button on a camera, then you can do it, and that's a great place to start, which is wonderful. And the technology is becoming much more affordable and much more accessible. So it's there, and it's available, and I'm happy to talk more with folks and direct them to resources. So young and old, everybody can do it.
Thank you.
Also, you can volunteer. I'm sure that John would be interested in people volunteering with him. I'm working with LiDAR, and that's another technology. I would be very happy to have students volunteer to learn how to use the GIS. So, I mean, as we're in the field, or when we're in the field, I guess is the best way to say it. I'm sure contacting all of us, or any of us that have been presenting all morning and subsequently, would be very welcoming to people who would want to learn.
Thank you. It's very refreshing to hear that technology is accessible and starting simple is possible. And I think that for many of our viewers, especially our young university students, that is refreshing to hear. So just as a reminder to the audience, we will have at Heritage Education Network Belize's website available the contact information for our presenters today. Thank you, Professor Lucero, Dr. Spenard, and Dr. Ford for being here with us today. This wraps up our segment for this afternoon.
And thank you for Cynthia also.
Sorry. Thank you, Cynthia. She's not with us here now, but she did tune in. This wraps up this segment for this afternoon. We have one more segment for today, starting at 3:30 p.m., and you can log on Facebook to the stream, ask your questions in the comments, or you can tune in on the national channel. Thank you.